Welcome to Paula Live. It's Thursday, March 7th, 2013, and I'm so glad to be here trying to hook up with our guest today, Murray Silver. I hope it turns out I have him where I try to get a hold of them, and right at the last minute, they're ready to go. So we'll see what happens here. While we're waiting, I have the little Dan Hagen, Soul's Cry. Enjoy. Hello, we're back live, and Murray Silver Jr. is with us. I'd like to tell you just a little bit about him. He's an American rock music writer and photographer. Silver was born in Savannah, Georgia in 1953. At age 16, he and his father, a lawyer, promoted rock concerts in Atlanta, bringing many future groups to the city for the first time, including Fleetwood Mac, the Grateful Dead, the Allman Brothers, Sonny and Cher, and Paul Simon. You can read more about him. He's right there on Wikipedia. Just type in Murray M. Silver Jr. Hi, Murray. Thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure. How are you today?
Oh, just a bit cold, but I'm so excited to be talking to you. You've had an incredible life.
Well, it's been an interesting time. It's been an
You've
interesting
you've
time.
you've done so many things, and you've written all these amazing books. And one question I don't want to forget to ask you: will there ever be a book on your life and all these experiences coming together?
I wrote a memoir only to find out that nobody really cared. But I say that parenthetically.
Yeah.
The book that I wrote was not so much about me, but about the people that I have met in life, and it is the classic illustration of the 6 degrees of separation. Because in my lifetime, I have not only worked with everybody in the rock and roll business and the movie business, but my father was Martin Luther King's lawyer. He was Coretta Scott King's lawyer. He was Andy Young's lawyer. And I grew up in his law firm and worked with him and knew those people intimately. And I then in 1988, through the actor Richard Gere, I went to work for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So the
Wow.
book that I wrote about me was the story of how a nice Jewish boy from Savannah, Georgia, ended up working for Jerry Lee Lewis, Elvis Presley, Coretta Scott King, and the Dalai Lama. And you get there step by step because there are people who, when they meet me, if they know anything at all about me, they'll say, "Well, how did you how did you get to meet the Dalai Lama? That's not an easy thing to do." And I said, "Well, Richard Gere introduced me."
Absolutely.
And they'll say, "Well, how did you meet Richard Gere?" I said, "Well, Dennis Quaid introduced me." They say, "Well, how did you meet Dennis Quaid?" I said, "Well, Jerry Lee Lewis introduced me." And it goes on and on and on. And pretty much is the illustration of my life, and as it is with most people. But the thing is that in this lifetime, you're right. I've traveled a lot of paths and a lot of roads, and I've worn a lot of hats. The one thing that seems to connect all of it is spirit. It is the spirit that runs through the thing, is the connecting force, and that is what my book is all about. However, when I tried to get the book published, my agent sent the book to all of the publishers in New York, and all of them turned it down because they thought it was a work of fiction. They
I'm
couldn't
sure.
believe that one person had done all of this stuff, and they said to my agent, they said, "Look, if he's done all of these things as he says he has, how come we've never heard of him?" And my agent said, "Well, that's just the thing. This is not so much about Murray. It's about the people that he's known and worked with and worked for. It's not about him. It's about them." But in any event, nobody wanted to publish the book. It was published by a small press in the southeast, and I think it sold about 14 copies. And right now, to find a first edition it's extremely rare, if only because the book did not sell. The book is called "When Elvis Meets the Dalai Lama," and the title addresses the scene that I have in my mind that one day when I'm dead and gone, and on the other side, should Elvis Presley meet the Dalai Lama, then I'll be the guy that handles the introductions. And so I've always looked at myself as being, I'm not the subject of the story. I'm the witness to it. I'm not the guy who goes to the events and sits at the head table. I'm the gatekeeper. And I've always recognized my station in life, and I've never really risen above it, but that's not to say that it isn't an important one and one that I have fully enjoyed. So I have written all of my favorite stories, but it never found a broad readership, if only because it's the kind of a book that the few people who've seen it don't believe. They just don't believe it. They don't believe it. When I tell people, for example, Paulette, Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King were guests at my wedding. When I tell people that, And oftentimes when I'm talking to black people, I say, well, I don't know if Coretta Scott King was at your wedding, but she was at mine. And they'll say, why? I said, well, it just so happens that not only was my father her lawyer, but my mother and Coretta Scott King had the same birthday, April the 27th. And for many years, we had a joint party for both ladies. And it was just the Silvers and the Kings in attendance. And we knew them that well
Wow.
that we were guests in each other's homes, and these were friends of ours. And there aren't many white people in the South that can or will say that. But the
Absolutely.
bottom line is I realized the fact that my father put me in some very interesting perspectives, and I do write about them. And it's the things I've enjoyed about this life is the path that my life has followed, even though I didn't know where the hell I was going. So to answer your question, there's a book out there, but it
I'm
ain't
gonna
easy to
find
find.
my copy.
All right.
You know what? You may see a little rise in it. The people who show up for shows, other people are working and say, "When are you going to put the pod up of Murray Silver?" So,
Well, it'll have to be a slow day when they do that.
oh gosh, you've already have my interest peaked, and I love the way you write.
Well, thank
Great Balls of Fire, Behind the Moss Curtain. Oh my God, these were books I could not put down. And speaking of Great Balls of Fire, what was it like to be around Jerry Lee Lewis?
Well, it was dangerous. In a word, it was
I
dangerous
can
because
imagine.
when I was working with him, this was 1979 to 1989. Jerry is still with us, but Jerry has been very sick and for the most part confined to bed for the past year or two, and
Oh,
he rarely performs anymore. But 79 to 89, he was still vim and vigorous, and he was still touring, and he was still getting in and out of marriages. And but the thing was that Jerry Lee Lewis was fueled by drugs and alcohol. And if you were around him, if he was drinking, you had to be drinking, or
I
else he
know the
didn't want you to
type.
be in the same room with him. He didn't like the fact that we weren't all on the same page, so we weren't all on the same level playing field, and he did not like feeling that somebody was watching him, and he was very,
Oh,
very paranoid. In other words, if you were in the corner of the room having a conversation, he had to know what the hell you were talking about. But the thing was, he was always very, very, very edgy, and he was dangerous to be around. And so consequently, I found myself being always on my toes and being very, very, very defensive because this is a guy who was literally capable of doing anything at any moment. And so it was a very edgy thing, and he was also very uncooperative as an interviewer. He did not want to discuss his life, if only because early in his career, the press had humiliated him and
oh,
destroyed his
they
career
chewed him up.
when they made his marriage a front page story when he married his 13-year-old cousin, and
Yeah.
the media had destroyed the man's career, and he therefore had a hatred for anybody with a pen and a pad in their hand. But the thing was this: by 1980, there were an awful lot of people that wanted to make a movie about him, and he was motivated by the money. But he also he wanted the book and the movie, but at the same time he didn't want to have to go through the process because when Jerry Lee Lewis sits down and starts telling his life story, there's an awful lot of pain in it. Two of his three children were already dead. He's had 7 marriages. Both of his parents were dead. Most of his friends were dead. There was a lot of passing of the caskets, Paula. So the thing is that
Oh,
Jerry Lee Lewis didn't want to discuss that life, and so when I signed the contract with William Morrow to publish to write this book, I thought I could write the book in 90 days. It ended up taking me 3 years, and I interviewed more than 100 people, and everybody had. I mean, I had so much stuff on this guy that the first draft of the book was more than 1,000 pages long. And
wow.
when I delivered it to my editor in New York, she thought it was a joke. She said, Murray, we can't publish a 1,000-page book on Jerry Lee Lewis. She said, look, we will publish a 300-page book, but not 1,000. And I said, yeah, I know that. I said, but here's my guarantee to you. You don't have to start at the first page. pull out any 10 pages of this manuscript and read it. And my guarantee is that you'll read the 10 pages that come before and the 10 pages that come after. And I said, just read it. I said, because this is unlike any other story I've ever seen on this planet. And so my editor waded through this monstrosity, and she finally got back to me. She said, you're right. She said, the story's incredible. She said, but we still can't publish a 1,000-page book on Jerry Lewis. She said, it'd be too expensive. And so the book that finally hit the shelves was a third that size. And I remember going through a very painful process of editing where I had to throw out the first 5 chapters, which had taken me a year to research. But in any event, it was my first book, Paul. I did not know how to write a book. I was just starting in the game. I had been a writer for rock music magazines and a tour photographer, which was an outgrowth of my days as a concert promoter in the late 60s and early 70s. And so I had all of this access to these people, and I wrote about them, and I photographed them, and that's what led to writing that book. And as I said to you at the beginning of this conversation, one thing leads to another and another and another. And then I remember one day I was at a concert in Atlanta, and I was covering the event. I was the photographer for a record company, for A&M and RCA Records, and I was at this concert, and back in those days, at the end of a concert, the record label would have a party for the act and for a guest list, private guest list after the show. And I went to this late night breakfast, and I was sitting at a table with a woman who was a very attractive middle-aged woman. And I remember Elvis Presley had just died. And when she found out that I was a music writer, she said, well, what do you think of Elvis? I said, well, I'm very sorry that the guy's gone. I said, but I was never a big fan of his because this is a guy who put out 1 or 2 decent rock records, and the rest of it was kind of schmaltzy, Love Me Tender and that kind of thing. I said, that ain't rock and roll. I said, but in any event, I said, we'll all miss him. I said, but I was more of a Jerry Lee Lewis kind of guy.
Yeah.
Jerry Lee Lewis, the guy you see on stage is the guy he is at home, and he's romping, stomping, and that to me is rock and roll. And
Wild and electric.
yeah, and I told the lady, I said, if he hadn't married his 13-year-old cousin, he would have been bigger than Elvis Presley.
I think so
And the
too.
woman said, do you really think? I said, I guarantee it. And I said, but here's the
Ooh.
odd thing. I said, Jerry recently got a divorce from that woman, from his child bride, and she's disappeared. And I said, I know she's got a hell of a story to tell. And the woman turned to me and she said, well, what would you say if I told you I am that woman?
Oh my God.
I said, wait a minute, you're the child bride. I grabbed her purse from her and took out her wallet and grabbed her driver's license. And it said Myra Lewis, born 1944, plus 13 is 1957, the year she
Wow.
married Jerry. And in her wallet were pictures of her and Jerry and their children, one of whom was already dead. And I said to
Unbelievable. What
Myra,
a time.
I said to
Dude.
Myra, I said, what in the world are you doing here? And she
Yeah.
said, well, after I divorced Jerry, I moved out to Stone Mountain. And she said, nobody knows who I am. And she said, I'm an accountant for a little company. And she said, I've just disappeared. I said, well, lady, I'd love to write one of those Where Are They Now kinds of stories about you for People magazine. And I sat down with Myra Lewis and did an interview. And
Wow.
at the end of the interview, I'll never forget, Paul, I went home and I started typing it up for people. And I had some more questions for Myra. And I called her on the phone. I said, I'd like to come back and see you and ask you a couple of other questions before I finish this thing. And she said, well, good. She said, I just found my old photo album. And she said, I'm
Wow.
sure there's some pictures in here you're going to want to use for your article. So I went back to Myra's house, and she put in front of me a collection of rare, unpublished photographs of everybody you ever heard of in rock and roll.
What a gold
These
mine.
were rare photographs of Jerry and Elvis and Buddy Holly and Gene Vincent.
I
Everybody,
don't
this is,
even need the I don't even mean the money, but what a gold mine of images.
I mean, really, I mean, I'm looking at stuff and I said, lady, I said, do you know what this is worth? She said, no. She said, look, I've just
Oh
had
my
this
God.
forever. And I said, listen, you've got photographs of everybody. I said, this is stuff at home, backstage, on the road, at parties. I said, this stuff is worth a fortune. And so, as they say, every picture tells a story. And I'm sitting there with Myra, and I can't write fast enough. And I remember we spent about a month doing this. And at one point, she said to me, "Wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. What are we doing?"
Wow.
I said, "Well, I'm trying to write this article." She said, "Article?" She said, "You got enough to write a book." I said, "Well, you know something, Myra? I bet you I could write a book about you." And she said to me,
Wow.
"Murray, I've always wanted to write a book, but I've only found writers who were just interested in Jerry. They wanted to get to him through me. They weren't really interested in me." I said, "Well, I think you're the story. I
Yeah.
think the story told from the perspective of a 13-year-old girl who marries her cousin. I said, I think that's pretty compelling stuff." And
Absolutely.
so we started then in 1979. We started the process of writing that book, and as I say, it took 3 years to put it together. But it was a better education than the one that I got in college and law school, and they were events that I
Yeah.
will never forget as long as I live.
What a treasure. Do you have children?
I do not. Well, not that I know of. There's a
I'm
rumor of
wondering to pass all this, all this
there's the
history down.
rumor of one. There's the rumor of one, but it hasn't been confirmed to me. I'm almost 60 years old, and for some odd reason, I still harbor the desire to be a father, if only because I understand how spirit functions in this world, and that it never dies. It's always moving through,
This
and so
energy.
I don't want to be a roadblock in that that river of becoming. I don't want to be an obstacle in the path. I'd like to pass it on and continue, but I have not found the mother of my children apparently yet.
Yes, and you'll know her when you do.
Oh yeah,
There'll be no doubt.
oh yeah.
Wow,
I'm not
amazing.
done yet.
We've only just begun.
Well, it's not like I say. It's not that we've only just begun. It's just that we've been at this a very long time, and there's no end to it. There is no end to life. At least
Energy doesn't end.
that's
It
what spirit's
moves.
shown me.
Absolutely. Now, did Jerry Lee Lewis ever comment to you about Great Balls of Fire?
He did. When the book was published, his daughter Phoebe read it to him every night as he was lying in bed. She would come in and read a chapter to him.
Oh, I'd love to have been a fly on the wall
And
and watch his expressions.
finally, one night, late at night, the phone rings, and it's his daughter Phoebe, who later was his manager. Phoebe said, "My daddy wants to talk to you," and I was paralyzed with fear because Jerry Lee Lewis warned me the first day that I met him. He
Oh
said, "If you
God,
say
because you
anything,"
know how he feels about
he
people.
said, "If you say anything bad about my mother, I'm gonna kill you."
Oh
And
dear
so
God.
I was scared to death of what he would say to me. But in any event, he picked up the phone. He said, "It's the truth. It's nothing but the truth." He said, "I think you did a terrific job." He said, "I just want to tell you that."
Awesome. Wow, that
He
must have
said, he
really
said, "I
made
didn't
your day.
expect anything more, anything less." He said, "It's the truth." And that was, to me, the highest compliment he could make. Because, listen, the truth is ugly and the truth is painful. But he gave me his blessing. He hated the movie, but then again, we all did.
Yeah.
But in any event, he admitted that the book was true. It's hard to enjoy that book, but he admitted to me that it was true and that he was not disappointed
There's a lot of painful stuff in there for him, I'm sure.
from day
I
one.
was fortunate to read the book before I saw the movie, and then that's why I was so disappointed in the movie. If you haven't read the book, you can still get it, you guys. Great Balls of Fire, the uncensored story of Jerry Lee Lewis.
It's not in print, but you can find it on eBay all the time. In
Oh,
fact,
yeah,
that's what I
eBay's
have to
got
do.
everything.
I've given away all my copies, but I go on eBay and I buy them back just to give them to people because people are always asking me for that book 30 years later.
Oh, I'm sure. What about Behind the Moss Curtain?
Behind the Moss Curtain is a collection of true Savannah stories about the colorful characters that made life in this town interesting over the past 100 years. The stories include my grandfather, who was a bookie and a bootlegger, and for 40 years ran a bar here in this town, and all of the characters passed in and out of that bar. And so that book is still in print, and
Yes.
it also has a couple of stories that involve the ghosts for which Savannah has become famous. This is a town that's been called one of the most haunted in the world, and maybe the most haunted city in the United States.
I
And
don't know.
anybody,
I always thought everyone could do this, but I could feel it. You can feel Savannah
yeah,
when you go there. You can feel it. And it's, if you've never been to Savannah, Georgia, you've got to go. It's just an experience. History surrounds you and
yeah,
it's alive. It stays alive in Savannah.
and it's different from other places that are also like that. And I've been trying to get to
True.
the bottom of it. I've been trying to explain it because it is that different from so many other places, but also similar to places like Gettysburg or New Orleans or Charleston. There's something that these places have in common, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of why here and why this stuff is happening to the extent that it does. And for me, well, for anybody who lives here longer than 5 minutes, you're going to run into a ghost.
Yes.
And so I have been, since I moved back here, I've been trying to get to the bottom of it so that I could explain it to other people.
That's amazing. Especially where we have some really messed up history, and not just the South or the United States. This world has some really messed up history, and these places have that these traumatic events took place are just awful, hateful things that hate stays. And there is a show that it was done on these psychics that did, oh gosh, I'm trying to think of what it was called, but they invited everyone in to debunk it and everything. And one of the spirits that they captured had answered that you don't take it with, all you take with you is love. So it almost makes sense that that bad energy sits in that area. And I don't know. It's a mystery. Maybe you can solve it, Marie. You've got the skills.
Well, the thing that I'm encountering is that the biggest problem with pursuing the paranormal is there's a lot of stuff out there that isn't spirit.
Yes,
And
that's the
and
dangerous
and when you
part.
encounter it, you don't know what it is. It knows what it is. You don't. Not everything that goes bump in the night is a ghost. And
Exactly.
consequently, there are an awful lot of other possibilities out there, and quite frankly, some of them are scarier than anything Stephen King ever wrote about or anything that's ever been in the movies. And and therefore, the problem with ghost hunting as a hobby is that it is fraught with peril,
Yeah.
and it's not advisable. And I tell people to come to Savannah because right now we've got 50 different companies that are doing ghost tours,
Oh,
and
they've
I
just
am
spawned everywhere.
and I have told people, said, listen, this is not a smart thing to do, and it's not a safe thing to do because this stuff can latch on to you, and it can affect you mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. And I said,
And it,
if you don't know
absolutely,
how,
it can affect your marriage, your family, your children, and it can disguise itself to where you think grandma's here.
yeah. So therefore, I tell people, and I don't look. I have a lot of friends who make a living from the paranormal, and I realize that I
I
am
don't charge
impacting
for
their
my
business.
investigations. I just, when someone asks me to help, I see what I can find. And a lot of time I find pipes, unlevel floors, doors with broken latches, you know, and just put somebody's mind to ease or make people mad. I'm like, well, your ghost didn't make itself known to me if you've got one. I'm not saying you don't. I'm just trying to explain what's going on.
Well, there are things going on in Savannah, Georgia, right now that are just unspeakably horrible, and it's not just your typical ghost hunting stuff.
Can you share
And in
some of
fact,
that?
in fact, the Catholic Church has turned away from one of them because, quite frankly, they can't handle this. And so,
They're opening doors.
yeah, yeah. And sometimes, like I say, anything can come through it. And A lot of times
It's not to
people don't.
play with. It's not a toy. It's not a weekend giggle.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't understand that you open that door, if you don't know how to close it, then you've got real trouble on your hands. And that has happened to a historic house in Savannah that has turned into a tourist attraction, or actually a tourist trap. This is an old house that the owner could not afford to keep or fix up, and he couldn't sell it once the real estate market dropped out. And so he decided to turn it into a historic home, only to find that he could not fix it up to turn it into a first class house museum. And so he didn't have the furnishings and so forth. All he had was empty rooms. And so he decided to play up on its haunted history. And in the process, he allowed some clown to come into the building and hold a seance, and apparently opened up a portal that he couldn't close. And now you've got all kind of stuff bouncing around this house.
Oh,
And
jeez.
the odd thing is about this one, Paul, is that there were two guys living in the house who were like caretakers and tour guides. Both of them very mild-mannered guys. One of them worked as a custodian for our local school. And oddly enough, uh, they started to drink and do drugs. And all of a sudden, you saw a
They were
change in
under
these people.
attack.
You saw a change in these people mentally and emotionally and spiritually. And the last I heard of one of them, they were arrested by the FBI for having sex with a minor that they had met online,
Oh, dear
and
God.
they put him in a federal penitentiary. And it continued to get very bad for both of these boys. And it seemed to me that they were possessed by something that was that had crossed this portal, and you could literally see the transformation very quickly happen. This isn't something that happened over a long period of time. This set about very quickly, and so again, like I tell people, this is something that you don't play with.
Time and time again, I'll be on investigation. I've already talked to the people. Someone will fess up. Well, yeah, we did do try to make a Ouija board once or something. That'll never come up. I'll ask it, and then after a while, it never fails. Where I get some really bad things going on, they're tampering with it. They're playing with it. Everybody got wasted and said, "Let's contact Aunt Linda."
Well, the problem with the Ouija board is it's kind of like an open line to the universe, and just because you dial up a number doesn't mean that that person is going to answer. And with a Ouija board, it's just an open line. It's like a party line, and again, you have no idea what's answering the call, and so you have to be extremely careful if when you're venturing into an unknown, because any number of things can happen, and no matter what happens, you can't explain it. It's not easy to come up with an explanation of what's happening. And so that's why I'm not surprised there's been a proliferation of ghost tours and ghost television shows. But what surprises me is the great number of people who just think that this is fun and games.
It's very dangerous.
Yes, it
Now,
is.
I don't want to spoil the book Behind the Moss Curtain, and you can tell I absolutely I'm just thrilled with it. Can you tell a little bit without ruining it? Can you? I mean, it's a collection of your stories. Can you give us some little teasers from the book?
Well, I think um, the most important thing that's come out of that book is the title story, which is about a murder that took place in Savannah in 1945. Now, the biggest nonfiction book of all time, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, is about a
Yes,
murder that took place in Savannah, Georgia.
know that
This
well.
biggest That's the biggest book of all time. It's about a murder that happened in Savannah, Georgia.
Can you tell a
And
little
it
bit about that to people all over the world? This is going out that may not be familiar about this
well,
this murder.
back in the 1980s, there was a very wealthy gay antique dealer who murdered his boyfriend, and he was put on trial 4 times. They could never. There was always a hung jury. They could never convict the guy. And he was a socialite, very wealthy guy. And a writer from New York came down here to cover this story for New Yorker magazine. And he saw a bigger story here. And the big surprise was that when this book first came out, none of the publishers wanted it. First of all, it was a gay subject matter, and at the
Really?
time,
Oh,
and at the
oh yeah.
time, there
That
was
was a
not
time.
there was not an identifiable readership out there for subject matter such as this. And so John Barrett had a very hard time selling that book. The first deal was just a regional one, and the book grew legs, as they say, and it became the biggest selling book of all time in nonfiction. And it was about this gay murder in Savannah. And so when I moved back to town at the height of the midnight craze, the editor of the newspaper said to me, "Well, we would love to have you write for the newspaper." I said, "Well, I'm not interested in writing the news. I like stories and I like history, and I don't want to write the news." They said, "Well, you know, we'll let you write anything you want to write because I'm the
Yeah.
first Savannah author in history whose first book was an international bestseller and a major motion picture." And they said, "Well, you can write whatever you want." So I
True.
started writing a series of retrospectives, if only, Paula, because I stumbled into a McDonald's one day and I found a room full of old timers having coffee. And these guys got together every day because they had nowhere else to go, nothing else to do. And some of these guys were in their 90s. And they were very fortunate in that they could remember details of the past and of their history and the history of the town. Not only did some of them know my grandfather, they knew my great grandparents.
Wow.
And I
So
spent
this was
many
in
days sitting
Savannah.
around. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
spent many days sitting around talking to these guys. And these stories that they told me became the basis of the book Behind the Moss Curtain. But it was my editor at the paper who said, well, uh, there's been other famous murders in Savannah before the Jim Williams Midnight murder. And in fact, there was another very famous gay murder back in 1945. And the reason everybody still remembers it is because the murderer um, cut his victim up in pieces and scattered them around town. And anybody who was living in Savannah in 1945 has never forgotten that.
How
And
could
so
you?
my editor at the newspaper said, we would like for you to do a retrospective of what was called the Butcher murder. They said, we'd like for you to take a fresh look at this old story. And I said to him, I said, look, I don't want to touch that story. I said, first of all, everybody knows the story. Secondly, I don't want to write about cutting people up into pieces. I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
And so my editor gave me the old newspaper files on this murder back in 45. He gave me the files. He said, look, there's a story in this somewhere. Find it. And I swear to you, I went home and I started leafing through this gore, and I threw the file in the trash. And in the process of throwing the file in the trash, a slip of paper came sliding out, and it fell on the floor. And I had to pick it up to throw it away. And before I threw it away, I glanced at it, and it was the notice that had been published in the paper on the day that the victim in this murder was buried at our famous cemetery, Bonaventure. And the article said that the entire town had turned out at the funeral. It was a spontaneous outpouring of public grief.
Wow.
And I thought something automatically hit me that said, oh, you know what you ought to do? You ought to go over to Bonaventure and find this boy's grave. And the reason I wanted to do it was because my family has been buried at Bonaventure for 100 years. And in fact, my place is already staked out there. The
It's a
headstone is up.
beautiful place. A beautiful
Yeah,
cemetery.
it's one of the few
Ancient.
Victorian cemeteries in America. And my headstone is in place. The mailbox is there. I'm ready to do business. And so I thought, well, wouldn't it really be weird if the victim of this crime was buried like in our neighborhood?
Oh,
And
like
so
Mario. Oh,
I went
wow.
I went out to Bonaventure's one day. It was a beautiful day. I went out to Bonaventure and I drove all around because it's huge. And I finally found the grave of the victim of this horrible murder. And as I stood at the gravesite saying prayers for this poor boy, I
Yeah.
realized that the grave of his murderer is just a few steps away.
Oh, ouch.
Yeah, the family plots of the murderer and his victim are right next to each other in Bonaventure Cemetery.
Oh my God, how
And
ironic.
I thought to myself, there can't be any peace in this
Not at
cemetery.
night here, or even in the day, but it's more palpable at night.
So I'm standing there, Paul, and I'm thinking about it, and all of a sudden, a storm blew up from out of nowhere, like in a Steven Spielberg movie, and
Yeah.
the sky turned black, and it started to rain, and it rained so hard that I could not see to drive out of the cemetery, and so I had to sit in my car until the storm abated. And when the storm was over, I went home to discover that I had brought some people home with me.
You have
Now,
that light, yes.
I could not see them to make them out, but I saw shadows passing across the wall, and I had this buzzing in my ear, and this energy was very frantic, and it started bouncing off the walls until it started making cracks in the plaster, and then the
Wow.
paint started to peel off the ceiling, and I thought the house was coming apart poltergeist style. And so I
Wow.
called the Savannah Police Department, if only because the Savannah Police Department has been in
They're
the same
probably
building.
used to this type of stuff too.
Yeah, because the police station has been in the same building since 1860, and it is adjacent to our colonial cemetery.
Oh,
And the
Lord.
building is haunted on a daily basis. So I
I
called the
can
detectives
imagine.
and I said, "Look," I said, "I'm having a problem." And they said, "Well, um, we can't help you, pal. You need a ghostbuster." And they gave me the name of a psychic that they worked with. And I called this psychic on the phone, and before I could tell her what my problem was, she was telling me. And she said, "Sir, you got a house full of company." I said, "Well,
The
who is it?" She said,
visitors.
"Well," she said, "you've got a murder victim, and you've got his murderer, you've got their families, you got a cop, you
I don't
got
know if
some
you can hear
people."
my dog growling, and you could see the shivers on my skin. Just oh, keep going.
Well,
Sorry, sorry to
she went
interrupt.
on to say, she said, "You've got a judge, jury, and execution." She said, "All of these people
Everybody's
have
there.
come home with you." And I said,
They saw
"Why?"
you.
She said, "Well, you're a writer, and these people cannot rest in peace until the story is told." I said, "Well, how am I going to interview them if they're all dead?" She said, "Well, don't worry about that. Just write the story." I said, "Lady, you're not listening to me. I can't write the story. I don't have anybody to interview. Everybody that has anything to do with the story is dead." She said, "No, no, you're not listening to me. Just write the story." So, Paul, as God is my witness, I sat down at my computer and started typing out the story behind the moss curtain.
Oh,
And it is 100 pages long. And I wrote it in one sitting. And when I was done, it was about
wow,
4 o'clock in the morning. And when I finished it, I had to read it because I did not know what I had written. It literally just came through me like a channel.
that's
And I
amazing.
delivered it to my editor at the newspaper, who said to me, "Murray, we cannot publish a 100-page story in the
In a
newspaper."
newspaper.
And I said, "Listen, this is your fault. You told me to do this. This is the result." I said, "Besides, you ought to see what these people did to my house." And he said, "What people?" I said, "Well, never mind what people. Just read the story." So Peter read the story, and he called me on the phone, and he said, "This is incredible." He said, "I'm going to print this." I said, "Well, let me tell you what, Peter. If you're going to cut it up into pieces, don't
Yeah.
bother." He said, "No, no, no, no." He said, "I'm going to print every word of it." He said, "I'm going to do it in 7 installments." And he said, "But I'm going to publish every last word." He said, "I've never read anything like this in my life." So it came out in the newspaper in weekly installments, and it set this town on fire because now we
Absolutely.
had two famous murders, not just the one. But I did not write this story to jump on that midnight bandwagon because, first of all, I'm the kind of person who thinks that to promote a book and a movie about murder is the wrong thing to do in a town that right now is having a crime spree and is having an epidemic murder rate.
Yes.
And I did not think in good conscience Savannah could use another book and another movie about a murder. We have a murder a day in this little town.
Wow, I didn't know
And
it. I
so
didn't know.
consequently, I have resisted all of the offers to turn this book into a movie because I just don't think Savannah can withstand it anymore. And so that being said, there were some differences that I wanted to point out. But my point is this: the reason that Spirit wanted the story told is that the murderer who was thrown into the electric chair is someone who instead should have gone to an asylum. This boy was insane. This boy wasn't vicious. This boy was crazy.
Yeah.
But unfortunately for him, this was 1945, and his lawyer tried to prove to the jury that as the result of an injury to his head as a child that he had blackouts during which he had no idea what he was doing.
An
And
easy
the
place
term
to
the
be
term
taken.
yeah, the term blackout though had just been invented that year by doctors describing what was happening to soldiers in the field in World War II. And no one had ever gone into a courtroom and claimed blackout. And the jury didn't buy it. And they threw this boy in the electric chair.
Oh,
But in any event, Spirit would not rest until I told the story. And Spirit continued to let me know that it was at work on this. While the story was being published on these weekly installments, I began getting some very bizarre phone calls from people. One of whom was a woman who called me on the phone and she said, I have something that I think belongs to you. I said, what is it? She said, well, it's a photograph of the murderer, of Jesse the butcher. And all of
wow.
a sudden it dawned on me, Paula, I didn't have any photographs of him except what had been printed in the newspaper, which were very hard to see. I didn't have a photograph of him to put in my article. And she said, well, I have one. And she said, if you'd like it, come over and I'll be glad to give it to you. So I drove over to the lady's house, and she handed me an 8 by 10 photograph taken of this boy. And the photograph, his hair is slicked back, and he's smiling, and he's got this very bizarre look on his face, and that he's looking straight at the camera, but his eyes are drastically shift to the right, and he almost looks deranged. But the photograph was
Oh,
taken the day before they put him in the electric chair by the prison photographer. He
I
had
would be
asked the
looking
photographer
deranged
to
too.
take his picture so that he could send it to the only woman who appeared in his defense at the trial, a neighbor, who tried to tell the jury that they were putting a poor, sick boy to death instead of a monster. And he wanted to send the woman a thank you note, and he had this photograph enclosed in the letter. And I said to this woman, I said, well, what are you doing with this? She said, well, that woman was my mother. And when my mother died, this photograph was among her most prized
Oh,
personal possessions. And I've saved it simply because my mother did. And she said, and this is the only known photograph of Jesse McKeithen.
oh, bless him,
The
Paula.
photograph is worth not only just worth 1,000 words, it's worth $1,000,000 in that you look at the face of this boy and you can tell this is somebody who is not in their right mind. The day before they put him in the electric chair, he's smiling broadly like a bridegroom on his wedding day, but his eyes are radically shifted and he looks like he is insane. And he also looks as if his spirit has already left his body. So this photograph became invaluable to me because, as I say, a photograph is worth 1,000 words, and I included it in one of the installations, and it's also in my book. But I said to the woman, I said, well, I'm amazed that you've kept it all these years. I mean, you've kept this thing 50 years. And she said, well, no, I'll tell you something even more remarkable than that. She said, my house burned down last year, and I lost everything. And she said, I came back the next day and sifted through cinders, and I couldn't find anything except for this
Oh,
photograph that was
how?
lying in the
Oh
middle
my
of the
God.
rubble, unstained, untouched, unsmirched, unwrinkled, crinkled, or damaged. She said it was sitting there It was the only thing that I said, "Like, you got to be," because you know, I say because she said, "I figured this had to survive for a reason," and she said, "No, I think I know what that is."
Mm.
And so Spirit was letting me know that this story they wanted told. And of course, the difference that it made to Savannah was after all these years, you know, Savannah thought it knew the story and it thought it knew the conclusion, but Savannah never knew the truth of this boy's condition or why he did what he did. And so therefore, Spirit was able to rest, if only because I had finished the job of explaining to the rest of this town what actually happened here. And Spirit does that, I find. Spirit, when it has an unfinished business, will try to get somebody to finish it. And
Yes.
that that was the story behind. That's the backstory behind the cover story to my book, Behind the Moss Curtain. And it's odd, Paula, that after the book came out, I didn't hear any more from these people.
I was
And in
going to
fact,
ask, your house calmed
no,
down,
what
didn't it?
what I did was I would take copies of the articles out to the cemetery and I laid it on the graves of these people and I said, listen, I've done what you've asked me to do, and the spirit abated. It went away. And then about a year later, they dropped by to say hello, and I realized that the day on the calendar was the date of Jesse's execution, and he had just come through to say hello. But
Oh,
it was
wow.
truly remarkable to me that spirit, acting in concert, wanted the public to know what had actually happened here, and so
You know,
that
I had
to me was
another
a blessing.
famous man, and we were doing a show, and he wouldn't talk about it on air, but he did. He touched on it a little bit, but we were on a music break, and he's funny about people knowing about it. But as he passed this area, he was getting messages. You know, he's almost thinking himself crazy. He's always been a little sensitive, and he ended up being the one that paid attention to these messages and found a body. And the story's even on Unsolved Mystery, omitting his name, but he was the one that found that body. It did make it into a local newspaper with his name, but you know, he's real, he's, you know, real shy about letting people know that. And it does happen. And anybody out there, if you haven't read that book, buy the book. And if you want to talk to somebody about it, I love it. Grab me on Skype, shoot me an email like, oh my God, you know, and we'll talk about it, because I just absolutely love it when I get a great book and I have someone just, you know, like, oh no, that did not just say that too. And Murray, you just have a gift of writing. And another book, Who Killed Elvis Presley? Autobiography of Dr. George. I can't say his last name. Nick Populus?
That's why
No,
everybody calls him Dr. Nick. His last name is Nicopolis, but
Nicopolis.
that's the infamous Dr. Nick, Elvis's doctor. I wrote the book that that Dr. Nick waited too late to write to explain what had happened to Elvis. I wrote that book. The book turned into a huge scandal. In fact, that book is not
Yeah,
in print.
international scandal. That's
It's
not
not
in
in
print.
print. Yeah.
Has it ever been printed?
Um, I I embedded it in my book When Elvis Meets the Dalai Lama
Ah,
because we couldn't publish the book. And the story was just too good not to tell. I embedded it in my memoir. So all of the information I have about the death of Elvis Presley is in my memoir. The interesting thing is that Dr. Nick hired me to write a book in which his contention was that Elvis Presley had been murdered, and
a lot of people believe that.
Dr. Nick was just sick and tired of being blamed for killing Elvis with drugs.
Yeah.
It had ruined his life. It had ruined his career. I mean, it cost the man his license. It cost him everything.
Not
And
only,
Dr. Nick is still
yeah.
alive, and he's living in misery and torment because he can't explain to the world what really happened to Elvis Presley. He hasn't been given a chance. Nobody's
Yeah, a lot
really
of
ever
people
given him a
think
chance.
it was even it wasn't him, but that it was a job. So he just took the fall.
Well,
the
Um,
majority says it's Elvis's fault.
well, we're talking about, Elvis died in what, 77, 75, something like that. And the jury is still out on Elvis Presley's life and on his death. And imagine what it was like back in 1989 when Dr. Nick said to me, he said, "Look," he said, "I'm still in practice here." He said, "But this is a story that won't go away." He said, "Elvis has been dead a dozen years." He said, "But I'm still, people still all over me about this, and they're driving me crazy." He said, "I don't have time to write a book." He said, "But I've been offered $1 million advance by Jackie Onassis to tell my story." He said, "I don't have the time to
Wow.
do it." He said, "But if you do," he said, "I'll split this with you." And so I moved to Memphis, Tennessee, right after we finished making the movie Great Balls of Fire about Jerry Lee Lewis. And to show you how small this world is, Dr. Nick was also Jerry's doctor.
Oh,
In
wow.
fact, that's why Dr. Nick called me. One day, Jerry was in the office being treated with methadone, and Dr. Nick was talking to him. Dr. Nick said, "I'm going to have to do what you did. I'm going to have to write a book." And Jerry said, "Well, Doc, if you want to write a book, you might as well use the same boy that wrote mine because he did a pretty good job for me." And Doctor called me on the phone. He said, "Listen," he said, "if you'll come up here," he said, "I'll tell you the story I haven't told anybody else."
What a
And I said, "Well,"
recommendation.
I said, "Doc," I said, it's been really a long time, and everybody knows drugs is what killed him." And he said, "Well, I'm not so sure about that." And so I said, "Well, Doc, you're going to have to give me a pretty compelling reason to drop everything and move from Atlanta to Memphis after I've just spent 3 years chasing Jerry Lee Lewis around." He said, "I'll tell you what." He said, "You come up here, and I think I can convince you." And the first time I met with Dr. Nick, he told me, he said, "Look," he said, "I have proof that Elvis Presley was murdered." I said, "Murdered?"
Wow.
He said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, Doc," I said, if you will tell me that story, and if that story's true, I said, that'll be the biggest book in the history of books. That'll outsell the Bible. A book that's going to prove that Elvis Presley was murdered."
Yeah.
I said, "And you're going to name who?" He said, "Yeah." And I
Oh, wow.
said, "I'm your boy, Doc." Well,
International scandal.
I'll tell you what happened to us, Paula. I started putting together the book "Who Killed Elvis Presley," and it had Dr. Nick's name on it. And I sent it to our agent, and our agent sent it. The agent said, "Murray, this is going to be a book. This is going to get the biggest advance of any book in book history." And I said, "Well, Jackie Onassis has
Wow.
already offered us $1 million," and they said, "That's just for starters." All of a sudden, then we started getting responses back from the editors. Half of them didn't want to touch the book because they hated Dr. Nick because they believed that he was guilty, and they didn't
Oh,
want to hear
yeah.
any crap from him about murders. And a lot of them said, "Wait a minute, this is too late. He's too late. Other big books have been written about Elvis's death. He's too." I said, "Wait a minute, this is the guy. This is the doctor. This is the
In his
guy who they
own
called
words.
when they found him on the bathroom floor. This is the guy, the first guy they called. This was the first guy there." I said, "This guy knows more about Elvis Presley's health than anybody on the planet, and you don't want to hear from him." Well, long story short, nobody in New York would touch the book. And
Wow.
then it hit the news. It hit the news, and when it hit the news that Dr. Nick was going to write this tell-all book, then all of the pundits like Bill O'Reilly were jumping down my throat, and they were assailing us for a get-rich-quick scheme and all of this
Oh,
other stuff.
yeah.
And the whole thing just flew apart. We turned
Oh,
up on the front pages of all the tabloids, but not on the front page of the New York Times, which means it had moved from news to the world of the weird.
oh,
And
great.
at that point, the way your enemies can defeat you in this world is by ridiculing you. And so
Absolutely.
when they turn you into tabloid story, then you're done. And it's very, very rare that a tabloid story makes it to the front page of legitimate news. It's got to be really, I mean, these days, but back in 1989, no, 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 no. If you were on the front page of the Globe in 1989, you were not going to be on the front page of the New York Times.
No.
But in any event, the thing is that that book was never published, and it absolutely destroyed my career. And I had to go into hiding because there was a group of people who were
Oh, my
convinced
God.
that they were going to be implicated in this book, and these
Oh, my
people were
God.
trying to kill me.
Oh, my
Uh,
God. Thinking about that, because a lot of people think that those other people stalking you are exactly what happened, not the
well, but the thing
doctor.
is, these people were drug dealers who had been pumping Elvis
supplying.
with this illegal stuff off the street,
Oh,
and
dear
they
God.
thought that I was going to drop a dime on them in this book, and these are the people who came looking for me. And I went to the
Oh, my
Memphis
God.
police, and I told a sergeant, I said, listen, I said, this is who I think is looking for me. And he said, well, if that's true, he said, there's only one thing I can tell you. His name was Parker. He says, the only thing I can tell you is that I'd leave town if I were you, because the Memphis police can't guarantee your safety. I said, what? He
Oh,
said,
my
well, one of
God.
the guys is looking for you, murdered an associate. We could never hang it on him. And he's still running around. So he said, if this guy's looking for you, I'd leave town. And I did.
Oh, what in the world did you do?
I ran and hid. I came back home to Savannah, Georgia, and I lived for a year. Nobody knew who I was or where I was. I came back and hid in Savannah, and then I picked up again, and I moved back to Atlanta. And for a long time, I laid very, very low until these people understood that, number one, the book was not going to come out,
Yeah.
and number two, I wasn't going to drop a dime on them. And then when they were no longer afraid that I was going to do that, then they more or less disappeared and went on with their lives.
And it just backed away. What a frightening chapter.
Yeah, yeah. But
I
I'll tell
can
you something.
imagine.
But getting back to spirit, I'll tell you something fascinating, Paula. Because everything has got something to do with spirit. And
Me too.
so while I was doing this book with Dr. Nick, I interviewed a lot of doctors and nurses who had treated him, because I was trying to get to the bottom of all of his problems and what may have killed him or what didn't.
Yeah.
And invariably during these interviews with these doctors and nurses, at the end of the interview, when I turn off the tape recorder, they'd say, "All right, listen, there's something I want to tell you, but I don't want you to quote me, and if it comes back, I'm going to deny it." But what they all wanted me to know was that long after Elvis Presley was dead, he continued to haunt the hospital where he died. He didn't die in Graceland. They put him in the ambulance. They were able to revive him. He was not pronounced dead until they got him to the hospital. But doctors and nurses, more than a dozen of them, told me that long after Elvis Presley had died, he haunted the hospital where he died, and that he would often go into the rooms of dying patients to help them transition.
Oh,
And
he
and
had a
they
good
told
heart, you know.
yeah, and they told me that the oddest thing that a lot of people, as right before they would pass, at a point where a lot of people will see spirit coming for them, and typically it's your mother who comes for you on the day that you die.
Yeah.
Typically people look up and they'll see mama, or they'll see a spouse, or maybe a child who's come to help them cross over. And the thing that surprised all these doctors and nurses is the number of patients who'd say, well, here comes Elvis. Not here comes Jesus, not here comes mama. They'd say, here comes Elvis. And Elvis Presley was helping people transition. And I interviewed this one couple that had lost a child to some dread illness.
Oh,
And the little boy was 4 or 5 years old. And his
oh
last word, he woke
God.
up out of a coma to say, here comes Elvis. And he died. And the parents were
Oh,
surprised because they said that he did not even know who Elvis Presley was.
oh,
But in any event, that hospital has since been torn down. So I want to caution people: you can't jump up and go to the hospital in Memphis to find a glimpse of Elvis Presley. That
true.
hospital has been torn down.
Not
So
there
so
anymore.
don't go jumping around hospitals in Memphis looking for Elvis Presley.
Well, he had a good upbringing. He had a good faith. He had an amazing heart, and his energy was so huge and so big that to me and just the little I know about energy, it makes sense with his good heart to want to be there to help people.
Well, I will also remind you, dear, that Elvis Presley in life wanted to be a mortician. He had only two ambitions in life.
Oh,
He wanted to be a cop, and then he decided he wanted to be a mortician. And in fact, the people who own the Memphis Funeral Home will tell you that Elvis used to come over. It's against the law, but Elvis used to come over and watch them prepare bodies because he was fascinated by death and the process. And
really?
he wanted to be a mortician, and so he had an odd fascination with the process. But apparently, he stuck around to help people make the transition, and he was seen by many doctors and nurses and by many patients who are going through the death process. And I just find that absolutely fascinating.
Yes, it is. Because that's not something you have to be a special kind of person to decide you're going to go into that because, the last thing 99% of the people on this earth want to do is see somebody being disassembled
Yeah,
in that
yeah,
state. It brings up too much of our own mortality, you
yeah,
know.
yeah. It's bizarre.
Wow. And the Dalai Lama. Wow.
That's my
I
main
mean,
man.
wow.
That's my main man.
Out of everybody that you've been around, and we could talk for days, but what can you tell us about meeting him and and your contact with him? I put up a picture on my Facebook ads and the different ads for the show today, and again, wow, what an experience!
Well, Paula, in 1988-89, when we were in Memphis working on Great Balls of Fire, the movie, I was appalled at the process. I knew that this movie was going to suck. This movie was absolutely awful, and I was on the set watching this day after day, and I was sickened by what they were doing to my life's work. And I would complain to anybody who would listen to me. I would
I can
complain to Dennis
imagine.
Quaid. I would complain to Winona Ryder. I'd say, look, you people are making a farce out of this. This is not a comedy. There's nothing funny about Jerry Lee Lewis, and they played it for laughs. And so in any event, anybody that I mean,
They
people
did.
would avoid me because oh, here comes the writer. And writers traditionally have the reputation for being very critical of movies made about their books, and I'm no
It's
exception.
understandable.
Yeah, but in any event, I remember one day I was mouthing off to the wrong guy. I was talking to a cop who was now in private duty, the bodyguard for Dennis Quaid, and the guy was from Louisiana, a very plain-spoken guy. And he said, "Listen, stupid." He said, "Your book is being made into a movie." He said, "That's like winning the lottery." He said, "And
Oh,
instead of sitting
God.
around complaining about this, why don't you go ahead and capitalize on your good fortune and get your next deal up and running before this turkey bombs?" That's what the smart guys do.
Ah, he
And I
just
said,
threw out a perspective there I hadn't thought of.
yes, I said to him, I said, well, here's the problem with that, pal. I don't even have an agent. I sold the movie rights to this book myself. I don't have an agent that's working for me. And I said, I don't know anybody in Hollywood. He said, well, he said, you know what? He said, have you got another story that you'd like to? I said, well, I got a terrific story I'd like to make into a movie. He said, well, I'll tell you what. He said, before I came to work for Dennis Quaid, he said, I used to work for Richard Gere. He said, Richard Gere's sitting around right now, nothing to do. He said, why don't we call him? Now, I will remind you now, this was
Wow.
1988, and Richard Gere
Whoa.
had made the movie Officer and a Gentleman, but had not yet made Pretty Woman. And he
Yeah.
wasn't as famous then as he is now. So we picked up the phone and called Richard Gere at home in New York, and he picked up the phone on the first ring. And
Wow.
Bo introduced me on the phone, and I picked up the phone and I said, Mister, I got a movie I want to make. He said, well, he said, look, when you take the Christmas break and filming, why don't you come to see me in New York and tell me what you're trying to do? So long story short, during the
Yeah.
Christmas break and filming, 1988, I went to New York to talk to Richard Gere about making another movie. And at the end of the day, he said to me, well, what are you doing tonight? I said, I only come up here to see you. He said, well, he said, I got to run off. He said, I'm hosting a benefit tonight. He said it's a group of Tibetan Buddhist monks who are going to be performing a program of their sacred chants and dances at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. He said, and we're doing this to raise money for their monastery. And I said, why are you doing that? And he said, well, he said, I'm really into the scene. I've been studying it, and I'm very much into this scene. And you're welcome to come. So I had nothing else to do, Paula. And I went to the cathedral with Richard to see this performance, and there wasn't 100 people in the place because this was Christmas time in New York, and of all the things there are to do at Christmas in New York, this is the one that has absolutely nothing to do with Christmas. These are
True.
Tibetan Buddhist monks performing chants, and that has
Yes.
nothing to do with Jesus. So there's not 100 people in the room, and at the end of the performance, they had a reception. And I told Richard after seeing this, I said, listen, I don't know what just happened in there, but this is one of the most profound experiences I've ever had.
Wow.
I said, as soon as these guys began to chant, it just zoned me out. And yet I find this all very oddly familiar. And I can't explain to you the feelings I'm having right now. He said, I know. He said, the same thing happened to me the first time I heard the monks chant. I said, well, I can't thank you enough
Wow.
for this. I said, even if we never make a movie together, and we didn't, I said,
Yeah.
I want to thank you for showing me this. And he looked at me and he cocked his head to the side as he does in movies, and he said, how would you like to meet the Dalai Lama? And I
Oh my
said,
God.
is he here? He said, well, he is. He
Oh
said,
my God.
tomorrow night he's going to be attending a private function at Columbia University. He's in town to honor the first American professor to be endowed with a chair of Tibetan studies. And this is a professor that he knew when this man had become a monk. He was one of the first Westerners to become a Tibetan Buddhist monk. He said, and that man has now been endowed with a chair of Tibetan studies at a major American university, and the Dalai Lama has come to New York to take part in this private function at Columbia. He
How
said that if you'd
amazing.
like to go, he said, I'm going to be hosting this event. He said, if you'd like to go, you'll come with me as my guest. Well, Paula, the man that they were honoring was Robert Thurman, who still teaches at Columbia, has written several books, and he happens to be the father of Uma, the actress. And that is
Mm-hmm.
how Uma became an actress and how Richard Gere became a Buddhist, is their connection through Robert Thurman. So
Amazing.
the next
Wow.
night, the next night at Columbia University, I find myself among 50 people who've turned up for this reception for Robert Thurman and His Holiness. Now, I'm an unofficial guest, and quite frankly, I stood in the corner next to a potted plant, and I struck up a conversation with a familiar face who turned out to be the poet Allen Ginsberg.
Oh,
And
wow.
Allen Ginsberg was a beat poet from the 50s, and Allen was um, also one of the very first people in America to latch on to Buddhism. In fact, he was called a Jew Boo because he was originally Jewish, became a Buddhist, and
Mm-hmm.
Allen was one of the first people in the West to pick up on this scene. And so he and I were standing in the corner talking about what it's like to be two Jewish boys who are interested in Buddhism. And when
Yeah.
into the room comes the Dalai Lama, Richard Gere, and Professor Thurman, and
Oh, wow.
they proceed to go around the room and meet the other guests, and they stop just short of me and Alan and the potted plant, and they drop the Dalai Lama off in the middle of the room without introducing us, and everybody then turns their attention to the buffet. Because I want to remind you and your listeners now, Paula, that in 1988, the Dalai Lama had not yet won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
And this was at a time when many in this, people in this country did not know who he was, nor did they care.
Never heard of him. Wasn't
So
interested.
1988 now, many people did not know who the Dalai. They didn't know who he was, didn't want to know.
Yeah.
So so the Dalai Lama's standing there in the middle of the room, and I nudged Alan. I said, "Why don't you go and say hello to the Dalai Lama?" And Alan said to me, "You know, I don't have anything to say to the Dalai Lama. Why don't you go talk to him?" I said, "Well, I'm not even supposed to be here." And Alan said, "Well, you are here, and if you ever wanted to talk to the Dalai Lama, this is your chance." So I looked across the room at His Holiness, and His Holiness looked back at me, and he smiled and he nodded, which I
Oh,
took as
wow.
his invitation to approach. And I crossed the room over to him, not knowing what I was going to say to him, because there's no one to introduce me.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so when I finally approached him, I said, "Your Holiness, my name is Murray, and I'm a writer, and I'm a friend of Richard's, and that's what I'm doing here." And he smiled and he said, "Yes." I said, "Well, my name is Murray, and I'm a writer, and I'm a friend of Richard's, and that's what I'm doing here." And he said, "Yes." And then all of a sudden, without even planning it or rehearsing it in my mind, I blurted out, I said, in an overly familiar manner, I said, a very gifted psychic once told me that she thought that I had been a Tibetan Buddhist monk in past lifetimes. And the
Oh,
Dalai Lama began to laugh as if this is a setup for an old Tibetan joke. And I said, but what I want to know from you is, if that's true, if in my past lifetimes I was a Buddhist monk, why am I not a Buddhist monk now? And without missing a beat, Paula, the Dalai Lama said to me, because I need your help here. He said, I don't
Oh,
need any
wow.
more monks to take care of. He said, if I am to win my war with China, the war will be won in your country, not mine, and I need your help here. I said, well, what do you want me to do?
Amazing.
He said, well, you're a writer. I want you to write. I want you to tell people about what's going on in Tibet. I said, but I don't know what's going on in Tibet. He said, well, Richard will help you. He said, Thurman will help you. And I said, well, you know, I'm I'm not sure what I'm going to do for you, but I'm going to do something. Because, Paul, let's face it, when the Dalai Lama asks you to do something, you put it on your list of things to do.
Number
But I
one.
did not know at that point what I could possibly do for him. And so I
Wow.
said to him, I said, I would like to ask you for your blessing for that purpose. And he did something to me that I consider to this day to be quite extraordinary. He said to me, my name is Tenzin. He said, from now on, your name is Tenzin.
Oh,
And
big chills.
in
Oh,
that
God.
moment, he gave me his name as a blessing. And in that moment, I looked into his eyes, knowing that you're not supposed to. You're not supposed to look into the eyes directly of a realized being. In fact, traditionally through the years, when addressing the Dalai Lama, you were supposed to keep your eyes at his feet. You don't look into his eyes. It's considered to be disrespectful.
Yeah.
And then I discovered the reason why you're not supposed to look into his eyes. It has nothing to do with respect. Because at that moment when he did that, and I looked into his eyes, because I was stunned that he had said it, but when I looked into
Of
his eyes,
course.
all of a sudden everybody in the room disappeared. And we were surrounded by a very bright white light.
What a
And I
journey.
do not know how long I was in that state. But when I surfaced from it, I was not the same person. Now, that's not to say that I instantly became
Wow.
Buddha boy overnight, because I didn't. But
Yeah.
what it meant was that I no longer cared if Dennis Quaid ruined Great Balls of Fire. And
Yeah.
I went home and I told my family that something profound had happened. And they thought that this was some sort of a phase. And they said, well, how long do you think this phase is going to last? I said, forever. And the odd thing was is that I went home and I began to tap out an article about the Tibetans in exile. And I sent it to the New York Times. And not only did they publish it, but they published it above the fold and they gave me a half a page. And they assigned one of their
Wow.
cartoonists to do a line drawing of His Holiness. And I felt that I had been specially endowed to do this to help these people. But shortly thereafter, I get a phone call from Richard Gere, and he said to me, he said, well, you said you wanted to do something to help? Well, I got something for you. He said, there's a group of monks that are coming over here. He said, you know that program that you saw in New York? He said, well, I have a feeling that we could put that show on the road and we could raise a lot of money for these poor boys. He said,
Absolutely.
so I'd like for you to agree to bring them to Atlanta and stage some sort of a concert. I said, wait a minute, you want me to bring a bunch of Buddhist monks to the Bible Belt to do a program of their chants and dance? He said, yeah. I said, well,
Knowing that in New York you had, what, 50 people you were saying? Yeah.
yeah. I said, so you
Think
want
of
me to do this
that.
in Atlanta? He said, yeah. I said, well, Richard, I said, where am I going to put them? Well, I mean, what do you feed them? He said, look, don't worry about the details, just so you'll do it. I said, well, when did you want me to bring them? He said, well, the only time you can have them, because they're only going to be a short amount of time. He said, they're going to be in 3 cities. He said, the only time you can have them is the weekend of October the 3rd, which happens to be my birthday. And I thought,
Oddly
this is,
enough.
I said, you know what? At the very least, we'll have a party.
True.
And I have to tell you that the first time the boys, they got off the plane and I greeted them, it was like meeting long lost brothers. And
Wow.
all of a sudden, something began to kick in that was very familiar to me. And I found myself very easily picking up the language, the prayers, the whole thing. And as a result of this event, I became the road manager for these monks who are still in America today. And they have two groups that tour the West Coast, the East Coast, and they visit colleges and museums all over the country to do a program of the sacred chants and dances and to create a sand mandala painting. And they're typically in residence for about 5 days. And I was their road manager. I took them from town to town because I was the only one that could speak the language and I was the only one that could drive. And it was just like being on tour with rock bands, only there was no sex and no drugs and no rock and roll. It was a group of guys in a van, and we were going from town to town doing shows. So
What
this
an
is what I did.
experience.
This is what I did for several years, and I raised an ocean of money for these people. And so
Wonderful.
that's how I met His Holiness, and that's what came out of it. But it was life altering and life enriching, and it was the odd thing was is that I was able to touch these past life existences, and it was amazing to me that I've met a lot of high lamas, men who've spent their entire lives in monasteries, and they do not speak to me like a Westerner. They speak to me as a monk. And in fact, when other monks
Yes.
will correct them and say, "Oh, no, no, Murray's not a monk," they'll say, "Yes, he is a monk, and the only reason he's here is that he chose to be born in America to escape the Chinese, but his job is he's here to help us." And so the lamas recognize it, and that's good enough for me.
Absolutely. Just I think it's hard for me to think of people without all these extra senses. They may not believe we have them, but I don't believe they don't. I was
Well,
like,
everybody
you
does.
do. You can feel it. You just don't use it. Some
Well,
call it
it's because
intuition. Some ignore it or push it away because it's scary. But
well, I
what
think
a
the reason why
life, Murray.
I think the reason why many people do not pick up on these things is that they're bombarded by the sensory world, and they're not able to get down to these more subtle energies because they're bombarded by everything that they see and think and hear and experience. The physical world is so much more palpable, and it's
Mm.
hard for people to. And that is why the fascinating thing is, um, the monks that I lived with, they're all clairvoyant and they all see spirit. In fact, they don't even talk about it because it's commonplace.
Yes,
But then
it's an
again, people
everyday
will say
thing.
to me, people say, "Well, why is that so?" And I'll say, "Well, first of all, I want you to know, our day begins at 4 o'clock in the morning with 4 hours of prayer and meditation. The
Yikes.
day, the day naturally begins at 4 a.m.
Yeah.
And for the hours between 4 and 6, the window between this world and the next is wide open. And
Oh.
in fact, that's usually the times when many people have dreams in which spirit will speak to them.
Oh,
But in
that's
any
when I
event,
usually have the most vivid dreams.
well, if you are awake at that time and in a meditative state, you're able to retrieve even more.
I
And
didn't know
so
that.
people who spend their lives in meditation and prayer, to be able to see spirit and commune with it is just a byproduct of that lifestyle. So I was able to develop, if you will, much more quickly, if only because I was in the company of monks. And to
Yes.
them, this was nothing remarkable. This was commonplace.
Well, that blessing didn't hurt either when you looked
Yeah,
into his eyes and received that amazing gift,
he's
that
special.
recognition, that almost like a homecoming is
He's
how I
special.
feel when you told that. Like
You
he
know,
was just welcoming you home.
the remarkable thing about the Dalai Lama, Paul, is that when you meet him, it doesn't matter who you are, or what language you speak, or where you are in your development as a human being. He immediately is able to gauge that, and he's able to speak to that at your level. And that is truly a unique ability because he
Absolutely.
travels the world, and no matter where he goes, he is able to assess people like that and interact with them on their level, not his. And that is
It's
what I
as if
found
he
truly
looks
remarkable.
at them, he doesn't see what everyone else sees. He
No,
sees the truth of them.
well,
He sees their truth. So,
he's able to see far more than most people are able to see in each other, even detectives. He's kind of like a spirit detective. He's able to see where you are in the grand scheme of things, and he's able to say the thing that helps move you along. And I am so very grateful for the chance that Richard Gere afforded me, and
Yes.
I'm so very happy that I set aside the business of my life to do that, because the job that I took on for them, they couldn't afford to pay me. Not that I would have accepted it had they offered, but I did step away from the business of my life in order to help these people with their more important work, and that's what made all the difference. And as a reward, they showed me things about spirit that have helped me help other people that are plagued by it or don't understand it
You
or
have
having
to because
conflict with
that's
it.
your job now.
Well,
You're in it. You
it's
you were
not a
born in it.
vocation. It's not a
Yeah,
vocation in
not
the
per
sense that I don't get
se.
paid to do
Yeah,
it. It's my avocation.
absolutely. It's like, yeah, it's something you were meant to do. I
But
have
I
to
will tell
take
you this.
us.
I will
Yeah,
tell you this, Paula. You have. I never allow money to factor into any of it. If it's anything to do with spirit, I will not have money encroach on that. And
I feel the
because the
same
people
way.
who
It
exploit it for
dirties it.
money, the people who exploit spirit for money, will regret it. And I do not profit from my experiments with spirit. I don't profit from it. That's now a book like Behind the Moss Curtain is a different exercise entirely.
Oh,
But
yes.
I'm talking about working with spirit, disembodied spirit, working with ghosts and so forth. I don't do this for pay. I don't do this for profit. And I think that you have to be very careful when you're around people who do, because they have an agenda, and spirit is not at the top of that agenda.
And again, to me, when the money passes hands, there's an attachment that's not good in
Yeah,
the spiritual realm.
yeah.
That money should not go there. I have to take a second and remind everybody April 6th, Atlanta, Georgia. Don't miss the Atlanta Music Liberty Fest. It's at the Center Stage Theater. Doors open at 3:30 p.m. The event is scheduled for 4:30 p.m. to midnight. Come on out. We've got a lot of great entertainers: Tatiana Moroz, Jordan Page, Hart Sawyer, tons of speakers. We had a great time in Nashville. We're going to blow Hot Atlanta wide open. Get your tickets. Go on Facebook, type in Atlanta Music Liberty Fest. All the details are there, or just Google Atlanta Music Liberty Fest. So, gosh, it's so great to have you here, Murray.
I'm happy to be
Amazing.
here.
And I just absolutely love Kelly Spurlock. She's a mutual friend of ours, and I connected with her immediately. And thank you, Kelly. I know she's out there listening. And you guys that are nice enough and had the ability to go to the chat line, I can't see it today. I have a little thing. I can see the site, but the chat line is in dark. So you can Skype me or message me. We have some time if you have any questions, but I'm sorry that's the only way you can get messages to me today. Um, wow, the people that you've met, Murray. Oh my gosh, and and about with your father with the rock music, Fleetwood Mac. Oh my gosh, you spent some time around these guys, right?
I
These
did.
musicians.
I always have. When I was a little fella, I lived across the street from a record shop that my grandparents owned in the 1950s. And by the time I was a teenager, I had one of the largest private record collections on the planet. I always loved
Yeah.
music, and so consequently, when the Beatles hit, I was about 10 years old, and I saw the Beatles in Jacksonville, and
Wow.
I wanted to be a Beatle. And if I
Yeah.
couldn't be one, I wanted to be as close to this scene as possible. And I did not have any music ability. And so when I was 16 years old, I told my father, I said, this was 1969. And I saw what had happened in Woodstock. And I said, Dad, if there's 200,000 hippies that'll pay money to go see rock bands and sit out in the rain for 3 days to do it, then there's money to be made in this business. And there was no one promoting
Yeah.
concerts in Atlanta, Georgia in 1969. There was no one doing it. And so I told my
Wide
father that
open.
I thought that we could do it. But I want to remind you that in 1969, The most expensive act touring at the time was about $10,000, and I
Oh,
think the
yeah.
Rolling Stones at that time wanted $50,000, and which was just thought of to
Which was
be unheard of
unheard of. Yeah.
because tickets in 1969 were $3. You paid
Yeah.
$3 to go to a rock concert. And so I told my father, said, I think there's money to be made to doing this. And so my father's kind of guy said, look, don't talk about it, do it. And so when I was
I
in
love
high
your
school,
dad.
yeah, me too. When I was in high school, I on Sunday afternoons I started promoting rock concerts, and it was $3 to get in, and I was bringing bands to town that nobody had ever heard of, and
It's
that was
kind
the
of like what
problem.
we're doing with the music fest there. Well, I'm
Well,
sorry to interrupt.
let me tell you something about music fests. The first show that I brought to Atlanta in '69 was a brand new band out of England that had just recorded their first album, and nobody in the United States had ever heard of them because there weren't any FM radio stations yet.
Yeah,
All
true.
there was top 10 and top 40 and
Mhm.
pop music, but there wasn't any underground rock and roll, okay?
That's true.
And so when I brought this band to town, I didn't sell any tickets because nobody ever heard of them. Well, the band was called Fleetwood Mac. They were a
Oh, dear
five-man
God.
blues band out of
Oh,
England, and nobody came to the show. And
wow.
so my challenge was to turn people onto this music. And so what I did is I went to a country music radio station that was going out of business, and I said, "Listen, can I rent time from you for 2 hours in the afternoon after school to play this stuff?" And these guys said, "If you pay us, we don't care what the hell you do. You buy the airtime, you can yodel for 2 hours." And so afternoons after school, I'd go down to the radio station, and the guy who was the country music DJ would change his name, change his voice, change his delivery,
Oh,
and for 2 hours play underground music for the kids who'd just gotten out of high school.
absolutely.
And we
Cool.
started playing the music of the bands that I wanted to bring to town. And so in 1969 70, on Sunday afternoons, this is what I did. I was in high school, and I would sell the tickets to my friends, and I would try to sell 1,000, 2,000 tickets to pay for the band because the band would be five, six, $7,000.
That's a heck of a
And
job.
I brought the Allman Brothers and the Grateful Dead and
Oh,
Johnny and Edgar
God.
Winter and
These are my
Billy
people you're
Preston.
talking about.
Yeah,
This
I brought
is
all of these
fun.
bands, and but this was the first time people had seen them play,
Yeah,
and now they're all legendary, but back then nobody had ever heard of
absolutely.
them. And so here's the thing, though, I went broke doing this, as you might imagine.
Of course.
But a few years later, when I was in college, I got back in touch with them after they became famous, and they allowed me to write about them, to interview them, to photograph them, to go in the studio with them, to go on tour with them. And so
Oh, that opens so many doors.
yeah,
You know.
so I was able to. I called Mick Fleetwood on the phone. He was in Los
Wow.
Angeles. They were recording
I called
the
Mick
album
Fleetwood.
Tusk. It was a follow up to Rumors, which was the biggest selling album of all time. I called Mick Fleetwood on the phone. I said, "Do you remember me?" He said, "Well, of course I remember you." He said, "You were the first person to
Wow.
bring us to this country." He said, "What can I do for you?" I said, "Well, I'd like to write about you." He said, "Well, we've got a media blackout right now because we're working on this album." I said, "Well, I'd like to be the exception." And Mick Fleetwood said, "Well, for you, I'll
Wow.
do it." And I was the only journalist
Oh
in
my God.
America that was allowed to do an article with Fleetwood Mac in the studio while they were
Wow.
recording Tusk. And it was a front page story that I sold to a music magazine called Modern Recording, and that put me on the music journalist map. Because
Wow.
if I could get to people that
Absolutely.
Rolling Stone couldn't get to, then that meant I
Yeah.
had a career.
Yeah, when I call Mick Fleetwood, I get a restraining order. I'm just kidding. I
Ah!
don't call them.
Well,
Remember me? Yes,
next
and
time
I'd
you call
send
him,
in the cops.
you use my name and see if that'll
Absolutely.
get you a little further.
Yes, that would open some doors. That's kind of what I've just started a grassroots music show here, and I'm pulling all these new people and putting them on, putting their music on. We share it all the time, and interviewing these groups, and I love it. It's so easy to do, and who knows, we may have Fleetwood Mac, and a couple of years we've got little pods of some. And I'm telling you, there's some amazing people out there right now.
Well,
just trying to be heard, just trying to get out there.
the thing is, I find that you've got to keep it small, and you got to
Yeah.
keep it affordable, and you've got to be consistent. You got to keep doing it. You got to develop a base, and you have to forgive me, but you have to tap into the spirit of the thing, and you have to go where spirit conducts this. Now, I want to remind you something, Paul.
Yes.
Savannah, Georgia, right now has a music festival that is world class, and it is 100 concerts spread out over 2 weeks, and it's in
Wow.
late March, and it grew out of nothing. It grew exactly like what you've started. It was a
Yeah.
couple of concerts, and then it developed a base, a core of people got involved. It was all volunteer staff. The first couple of years, my wife and I were the transportation team for all of the acts. And so my point is, you start small, you tap into the spirit, you find kindred spirits, and you let it go where it wants to take you. Don't try to herd it in or corral it or put a fence around it. You let it.
Oh,
What I would do if I were you, I would go to area businesses and get them to sponsor this event in return for ad space. There's also money available to you from like the councils to the arts. You go to people
yeah.
like that, and you'll
I didn't
find that
think. Yeah.
there's funding for this sort of a thing. And then you
Yeah, well,
find
I pull
programs
them
that you take to
dry. I go to
schools.
these concerts and they know what I do, so I get backstage and I'll pull them dry if I like a band. If I can't stop thinking about their music, that's who I try to grab and bring on.
Yeah.
And I don't get paid for this. I do, and
Well,
I
not yet.
never ever thought I'd be a radio host ever. I don't know how I know how I got here, Steve, if you're listening. Um, because I worked the media for the National Health Federation, and I met a lot of different people from different stations, and all of a
Uh-huh.
sudden here I am talking to Murray Silver Jr.
Well, it's a small world.
Yeah,
We're all
it's just
connected.
amazing.
We're all connected.
Absolutely, what a life!
You know,
What an amazing
the
life!
remarkable thing is that it doesn't matter who I meet these days. I can talk to anybody for 5 minutes, and we're going to find a common ground somewhere. And we're
True.
all connected. We're all connected, and that is the wonderful thing about this life because we're actually here. We're supposed to be helping each other. That's what we're
Yes,
supposed to be doing. And the fact that we don't is the reason why the church beats us over the head with the idea, and the government is forced to do it when the church fails. And the
yeah,
great failure of the human experiment is the fact that there are too many people who do not realize that we are all one at the level of spirit.
absolutely.
The spirit that I embody, the spirit you embody, it all comes from the same source. And it passes through us like the wind does, like air does, like oxygen does. We breathe it in and out, and we share it. And it is amazing to me that after 10,000 years, that many human beings do not understand this. They only see differences. They don't see the common bond. They don't see the connection. They just see the differences in skin color, in ethnicity, in religion, in nationality. They find differences, and they look at you and say, "Well, that is not me that I'm looking at. That is you. That is other."
To
My training
separate
has always
is
been
not good. To
my training has
separate,
always
my
been the
goodness.
opposite of that. Whenever I see any human being, I think of them as mother. I think of them on the same level as mother, and
I've
that
been
I'm
called that by many psychics. I don't understand, but mother.
well. Bottom line is, I'm always looking for the common ground. That's how
Well,
I
this
prefer to
life
live.
is not a competition, people. It's a dance to a beautiful song. Let it happen. Work and troubles and all come in, and I look at people that are so totally blocked with that. I see it in their face. I feel it in their presence. This this oh my gosh, this big block of gotta do this, gotta do this, gotta do this, gotta go, gotta get this, gotta have this, and
Well,
it will kill you.
the physical world is very difficult to deal with because the physical world's agenda is altogether different from spirit's agenda. The problem
Yeah.
is spirit cannot proceed along the spiritual path unless it is in the body. Spirit has to be in the body to make progress along the spiritual path. Because once it leaves the body, it cannot act. It cannot gain merit. And so consequently, that is the reason we take human existence, so that spirit can progress along the path. And so your spirit, on one level, is being transported through this life by the body, and at the other, it's being imprisoned by it, because the
Yeah.
body has its own agenda, and the body
Sure.
demands it to be fed, clothed, housed, educated, medicated, entertained. The body has a constant demand and a desire that cannot be filled. And so therefore,
True.
spirit's business is sequestered to an hour a week in church, or maybe a few minutes of prayer, and consequently at the end of this life, we have not progressed very far spiritually.
True.
So the demands of the physical
Very
world
true.
is what's complicating the issue for people. And that is why, dear, people on the
Thank you.
spiritual path become renunciates and go into monasteries, not to run away from the world, but to
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 experience it.
overcome desire, so that they can deal with spirit. So they don't give up these things to punish themselves. They do it to free themselves of it. And that is why
Absolutely.
all people in the spiritual path, regardless of their sacred tradition, they go into they do the same thing. They give up sex, they give up alcohol, they are renunciates. It's not because they're punishing themselves, but because they have no more need of that kind of life, that they're trying to make progress on the spiritual path. And so consequently, spirit is at war with the body physical. That is the conflict that most people are losing. They're
So
having
would you
this,
say it was more like an opening up instead of a blocking them off?
well, hopefully they get to that point, but usually it
Yeah.
takes some sort of a tragedy to get them to do so. Like when the
Oh,
doctor says, you've got 6 months to live, you've got cancer. And then all of a sudden people want to get right with God.
yeah.
The idea is to try to live your life in a way that doesn't put you at odds with where your spirit wants to go. And oftentimes our profession does. Often the choices we make are taking us further away from where spirit really wants to go. I mean, spirit wants to be giving. Next, just conduct a simple experiment. The next time you do something where you are giving from your heart, where you're
Yeah.
giving, notice how it makes you feel. It is
Yes.
medicine. It is medicine when you open up like that. When you give, you feel terrific that, first of all, you're able to do so, that you're able to share, and that you have done something nice for someone else. And the bottom line is there isn't a feeling to match it. Although most people these days spend their time trying to grasp onto, trying to collect, trying to get. And notice
Get.
how that makes you feel.
What a
Notice how that
bottomless
makes you
pit of a life. You'll never feel that pit.
never. You
It
cannot
will never
satisfy
be full.
desire. In fact, that is the
Yeah.
reason why I believe there are ghosts on this planet. The ghost,
Yeah.
if you will, is the spirit of the person who dies and is still addicted to these desires and yet has no body to act on them. They still desire these. That's the hellish existence of the ghost. They do not have a physical body in order to satisfy desire, but they haven't overcome the desire. And
Ah, yeah.
instead of moving on, the ghost wants to go back and continue to be the person they used to be because they weren't done with that yet. I find most ghosts to be the result of murder, suicide, or an accident. These are
Hmm.
people who died before their lives were complete. They have unfinished business, but certainly they die in a state where their desires had not been met, and it's
It's
desire that
easier, I
causes.
think, for someone, that has an inkling, or doctors know, or they're really sick, that they can plan it out. But like when you said, it's sudden. They didn't get that, oh, I'd better change my heart, because I'm going to meet my maker time and make all those plans. So when it's sudden, don't you think
Well,
they don't, they're here and they don't want to let go.
I meet
Not every
um,
time, but the guys
I
that
meet
stick
I
around.
meet a lot of people, and they're all at different crossroads in their life. And I have counseled people who are terminally ill, and it's all the same realization. It doesn't matter when in your life or what causes you to come to the realization, but sooner or later you've got to take stock of the fact that you're not going to live forever and that spirit is going to depart this body and go somewhere and do something. And yet, here's my biggest problem, Paula. Is
Yeah.
science says that spirit does not exist. Science can't locate it in the body. Science can't tell you how it enters the body or how it leaves if it does leave. And the single biggest problem that I have is that science demands of me proof of ghost. It demands of me proof of spirit. And the reason science doesn't go looking for it itself is that science has nothing to gain. In fact, science learned centuries ago
Exactly.
not to poke its nose into affairs of religion because every scientist that ever did ended up dead and excommunicated like Galileo.
Yeah.
Galileo
True.
dared utter the blasphemy that the world was not the center of the solar system, that the sun was. And that got him not only excommunicated, but banished to hell for 500 years before the Pope issued an edict freeing Galileo from hell. Bottom line is, ever since then, scientists have pretty much been hands off anything that has to do with spirit.
True.
And science has nothing to gain by proving the existence of spirit. So I'm up against the battle from day one. I have to prove scientifically that it exists, or science says that I'm just, you know, telling tales here. So I am trying to prove the existence of spirit through the scientific method to satisfy the scientists.
That's
And I have a
amazing.
body of work, including photographs, which are quite compelling.
I
And
didn't
now
know if I should bring this up, so I'm going to let you go and see if it's all right. I'll let you bring that up. You're kind of touching on something.
well, what I'm touching on is that I now have the help of scientists from a number of different disciplines who are helping me understand what spirit is and what it isn't and what that means to you and me. And so I'm trying to come up with the answers to the questions that have always plagued mankind. For example, how is it that some people see ghosts and other people don't? Because science says that in order for something to exist, we all have to be able to experience it the exact same way. I mean, a glass of water is the same thing to me and to you, and everybody picks up that glass of water. That's what it is. And therefore, if I see ghosts and you don't, science says they cannot exist. And secondly, there must be something wrong with me. So,
Yeah.
one of the first questions I set out to answer is, why do some people see ghosts and others do not? And people say, oh, it's because you're spooky, kooky, or you're spiritual, or you're weird. No. It's got nothing to do with that.
I
In
get that
fact,
all
the
the
interesting
time.
thing to me is that many people will only see one ghost in their lifetime. Why don't you see all of them? And typically, the ghost that you see is somebody they're related to.
Hmm.
So, using these things, I'm starting to take a closer look. And so, my study led me to the ophthalmologist. I went to the eye doctor to
Oh,
find
wow.
out something about the human eye. And it's interesting to note that the human eye fully develops by the time we are 5 years old, and then it begins to decline. And the very first things that we begin to lose are the rods and the cones that pick up these other spectrums and dimensions where ghosts
That
are.
would explain children seeing them more
Children
often.
often see it, and adults do not.
Hmm.
And so the child that wakes up in the middle of the night and is scared by the ghost in his room goes and tells Mama. Mama comes in the room and says, well, I don't see anything. The child is now taught not to believe its own experience. And the child
I
is
was
now told
lucky
that's your
enough
imagination.
that my mother, would she would tell me over and over again, but one night she opened the door and came face to face herself. And after that, I saw it in her face. I was like, "Oh God!" Now we're both scared. She's not gonna protect me, but it wasn't a frightening. The frightening thing was there's this man in my room. He wasn't doing anything frightening, but then to have that experience, and I feel bad for these children that the parents don't see it. I'm so thankful for the gift to see my mom witness my dilemma at the time.
Uh, Well, I'll tell you a story that touches me deeply. Is that one of my favorite cases is there's a teenage girl here in Savannah with Down syndrome,
I have a
and
severely autistic son, so
do you? Bless you.
yeah.
Well, this may bring comfort to you, and I hope that it does. This child is 17 years old, and she will always be in the care of her parents, but
Yeah.
she's become more and more dissociative, and the doctors were telling my cousin, "You're going to have to institutionalize this girl at some point. You're not going to be able to deal with
No
this,"
way.
because she is always speaking to people that no one else can see and hear, and
What a reason.
she unfortunately, her boyfriend died of a heart problem last year, and she was forever talking to James, and to the point to where the child couldn't complete a meal without breaking off and talking to James, couldn't do anything. James apparently was with her 24/7, and her parents were scared to death that this kid was flipping out. And the doctor said, "Well,
Poor
we ought to talk
thing.
about institutionalizing her because
Oh
she's."
my God.
I
Oh
was
my
not
God.
so
That
sure that she wasn't
horrifies
seeing
me.
and talking to James. And
Absolutely.
so I brought in one of the world's great psychics who proved that not only does this child have the ability to see and speak to spirit, this is how we proved it. The child's grandfather died, and in his lifetime he had been many things. One of them, he had been a bookie, and he had been a professional gambler, and he used to bet the football games. And so at the end of the year, we gave this girl the list of all of the college football games that were going to be played, and there must be 50 of them. And
Wow.
we simply asked her to pick the winner of every game. And the entire family was in on this. This was a competition that the family was in. So there was 50 witnesses to this. She picks her selections, and she was right 48 out of 50 times. And the two she missed went into overtime and lost by a narrow margin. She
Wow.
got the answers from her grandfather, who'd been dead for 3 years. He told her who was going to win the games. And so we went back to the doctor and said, "Look, this child that you say is flipping out is dialed up and tuned in to spirit. And it is
Yeah,
absolutely
going to be
phenomenal to watch her."
institutionalized and heavily medicated for telling the truth. Oh
Now,
dear
what does
Lord.
that say, Paula, about all of the people who for centuries have been going to the doctors and talking about the
Mm-hmm.
voices in their head, the voices that told them to do something, the
Mm-hmm.
voices that tell all of us to do something? These voices in your head are sometimes spirit, sometimes it's your own conscience, sometimes it's spirit that walks in on you. It's happened to me, and all I can tell you is I have a great deal of empathy for people who think they're being driven crazy by it. But there's an explanation for everything in this world, whether or not science wants to agree with me or not. I can only point to some of these cases and say I have a view of this world that differs from science, and yet I've been able to help an awful lot of people with problems. I mean, who are you
Thank
going to
you.
go to when you've got these kinds? I mean, who are you going to call? You can't call a doctor; they will medicate you.
Right
So
away,
my
you're going to leave with several prescriptions.
well, and listen, you won't hear voices anymore, but you'll experience something much worse.
I had
Oh yeah,
one just strictly paranormal show. I did it to help a new station fill a slot. I did not consider myself as a host. It was helping out some friends with a great
right.
idea. And once I went to doing a variety show so I could bring in all kind of different things, I started getting a lot of messages like, "Oh, hey, wait, I didn't get my show." I was getting ready to go on air, and for some reason, I picked up a third voice in a place we shouldn't even have been recorded yet, and it stopped. And later, I figured out the voice was saying very clearly something about my sound, and the whole show after, the sound was completely garbage. And I have that. It didn't happen too long ago. We've
Well,
got about,
have
yeah.
you ever heard of the saying? In fact, the Police, the rock band, the Police, had an album called "Ghost in the Machine," and there's a phenomena that's been going on in recording studios for as long as recording has been going
I
on.
had a
Tape
feeling
recorders,
something
tape
told me.
recorders.
I even asked Kelly Spurlock, has this happened to you? Even before it happened, I knew someone was going to try to reach me that way.
Well, magnetic tape picks up spirit. And it is phenomenal the times I've gone into studios with bands, and this is the most sophisticated sound recording material on the planet. And it's
Yeah.
amazing. It picks up spirit, and it picks up stuff that's not going on in the studio. It is truly remarkable when you hear this stuff, because
Oh,
sometimes it's
yes.
voices, and
Mind
sometimes,
blowing.
yeah, sometimes it's people trying to give you a message, but sometimes it's people joining in the creative process. And I've gone in the
True.
studios where we have found tracks that none of the musicians have performed. It's
That's
just truly,
wonderful.
but the phenomenon is called Ghost in the Machine.
I didn't know
Look it
that.
up.
I'm going to. We've got about 4 minutes, and
Already? We're out of
yeah,
time?
I know. I would you please tell me that you'll be coming back to do another show? There's
Darling,
so much more to talk about.
I
You,
can't tell you I'm going to be here tomorrow, but in any event, if I am, you're always welcome to call.
oh, thank you so much. It's just been amazing. Is there anything you'd like to say as an exit?
Well, I would like to invite people to come to Savannah, Georgia. There's something going on here that is not going on where you live. And if you were looking for spirit, it's very easy to find here. We have haunted hotels, haunted bars, haunted restaurants, haunted squares, haunted parks. Sometimes I think there's more dead people running around Savannah than living. They're very
Me
easy to
too.
find. If you're looking for spirit, if you're looking for your own spirit, this is a great place to find it. It's interesting to me the number of tourists I will meet who've come here for the very first time and feel like they've come back to a place they've never been before.
Yeah.
And many of these people end up moving here because they feel compelled to come back here.
My
And it's
family are
interesting,
Salzburgers. I'm so we're really strong in that area.
yeah, but it's interesting to me that the people who do this will find that very quickly they start to make progress in ways that they were blocked before. They find the house of their dreams, the mate of their dreams, the job of their dreams. They find it in Savannah. They get back on track in Savannah. This is where people come to reinvent themselves, that
Yeah.
second act in life. This is where it happens, and they're able to do it because they're able to get in touch with spirit that they weren't able to access before. And it is truly phenomenal to me the number of people who come to Savannah for the very first time and find this place oddly familiar. So I'd like to invite your listeners to come to Savannah, Georgia, and experience what I think is what is truly phenomenal.
Oh, everyone should see Savannah at least once. You can't do it just once if you go there once. You'll be back.
Well, I hope so, and I hope that you'll come and see me sometime soon.
Oh, thank you so much. We're going to fade out to Dan Hagen's. Well, let's do some Tatiana Mraz country.
Sometimes it ain't easy to be free. Too many people trying to get a hold of me. They tell me what to think and what to do, that I've gotta move on and get over you. This is about a country and a love. We don't know what will rain down from above, 'cause it could be the end of the world. So I must choose to be a woman and not a girl. Wanna be the one who's strong. Sometimes I need a man to tell me what's right and what's wrong. I can admit I have thoughts. Get so mad I rip right through the walls. This is about a country and love. What will rain down from above, 'cause it could be the end of the world. So I must choose to be a woman and not a girl. I need you to be a man and not a boy, 'cause I'm playing for keeps and my heart is not a toy. Will you stand up and defend the house and home, or pretend you didn't notice and leave me all alone? This is about a country and a love. We don't know what will rain down from above, 'cause it could be the end of the world. I must choose to be a woman and not a girl. I wish that you could give me what I need, but you can't. And your words I don't believe. I'm asking for the best of myself, so I'll leave my lonely heart on the shelf. This is about a country and a love. Don't know what will rain down from above, 'cause it could be the end of the world. And I must choose to be